So when we're talking about US institutions, it's very important to disentangle the question of enslavement, racism, and colonialism. And I'm including racism in that category because universities, again, respond to each of these systems and structures in vastly different ways, particularly in the United States. So if we're just starting at the level of racism, how have universities, especially this past summer and fall, dealt with racism? Well, I think the greatest case can be made with after George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, you had universities and colleges across the country put out flyers, put out memorandums, put out statements saying that they were in support of Black lives, that they are committed to being anti racist institutions. Now, those statements are important in affirming Black life and criticizing or really attacking the roots of anti Blackness and white supremacy. But it also came with a note of sadness for many people, for many students and faculty, where if all universities and colleges were putting out this statement of anti racism, how, before this incident, how were they practicing their anti racism? Did universities and colleges overnight become anti racist? Well, what about those demographics? What about the actual curriculum? What about the actual institutional support and funding for area studies or for departments such as African American studies? How can these all be materially neglected and a university can still claim to be anti racist? So, on one hand, the way I see colleges responding to anti-racism or anti-blackness today is to put out statements, but because they don't have a structural analysis of anti-black racism, they don't see how the university can directly combat it. They might do programming, but nothing about the university has to fundamentally change in terms of hiring practices, in terms of curriculum, in terms of the investments universities make through communities for a university to be anti-racist, and I think that's fundamentally wrong. And we see that same issue pop up with both the issue of enslavement or slavery and coloniality. So in terms of slavery, I think there's been much more progress than in terms of colonialism. So universities across the country have created research programs to study the effects of slavery. They've supported individuals and institutions um, to not only study but bring this out in public scholarship. They have also provided scholarships, or some universities have provided scholarships to descendants of enslaved individuals. Other universities, such as Georgetown University, has allowed for preferential admissions for descendants of enslaved individuals. That was crucial to keep the Georgetown actually afloat during financial hardship times. Now, it's very important to note that that preferential admission did not come with scholarship support. So, undergraduate students actually voted and approved a reconciliation fee. And this fee would actually come, in a sense, as a tax to the student body in order to pay for scholarships for these descendants. Now, if we shift from talking about legacies, again, legacy admissions, and this is a particular and peculiar type of legacy in reference to the peculiar institution. I also just want to note that there's actually been an international consortium created called the University Studying Slavery, the USS. And this is comprised of many universities in the United States, a university in Canada, and some universities in the UK. So again, there are always going to be these international connections. And if a university or college is interested in joining that consortium, I would advise them to visit the website because that's another way of interacting. But the issue when we're talking about slavery and enslavement, or even the question of reparations, as we could see in Georgetown, is that when we're referring to slavery reparations, these are not public or social problems that can be solved by universities themselves. They require more from state and federal actors. And so universities might be able to study and support students, even support research. But when it comes to resolving or mitigating the harms of enslavement, a university can only do so much. Now, lastly, when we're talking about colonialism, I think in the US, this is the most difficult area for the US to actually grapple with because it's talking about the land itself. So if all universities and colleges are built on indigenous land, whether occupied indigenous land, ceded, unceded indigenous land, you have the direct confrontation of colonialism in terms of actual where your education, where your learning is taking place. And so I think there are some universities that are willing to start confronting the problems. So you start hearing a preponderance of land acknowledgments, of people recognizing that their land they're on is a land of indigenous people, multiple indigenous people, many locations at many colleges. But at the same time that we have land acknowledgments, there's not any further type of relationship established between universities and indigenous communities. There have only been some colleges, such as land grant or sea grant universities, that have dealt with, well, the Morrill Act of the 1860s really helped universities and colleges establish their funds and gave them land in which they can profit under. So the Morrill Act basically allowed over 11 million acres of land to be sold or held by universities and colleges that is over the size of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined. Now, given these factors and given that many universities and colleges still hold land from the Morrill Act, it's about really having a confrontation about what do we actually need to do to rectify colonialism. And some of that is the return of land, some of that is establishing at minimum relationship with indigenous communities. But I also think this is going to be the most fraught issue. Established the universities and colleges aren't very well known. Again, we have the admission of there being distinctions between town and gown. They're not really well known for having community relations. So whether your university is public or private, I do think that you need to make these acknowledgments because that's part of decolonizing the university. It's not just simply decolonizing knowledge systems, but decolonizing the relationships universities and colleges have had since the founding or even before the founding of colonies on this continent. So when we're talking about racism, enslavement, and colonialism, universities and colleges approach these in very different manners. But as lessons for the UK, universities and colleges in the UK might not have to deal with the question of colonialism that directly. They might not have to deal with the issue of returns of land, but they do have to deal with the issue of an imperial aftermath, of a return of colonial subjects back into the British Empire, or what we would call the UK today, and saying, what is a proper way for universities and colleges that have created colonizers, that have created imperialists, that have helped support the social foundations of their country to engage in these political projects? How can they support those individuals and families that were most disastrously impacted by these policies? And that isn't an easy question, but once you begin to see these questions, you realize that again, that there are burdens and responsibilities that not only students have, not only faculty and admin, but the university and college itself as an institutional body. Those are the responsibilities it has. So thank you.